Thanks for coming. I'm going to be talking a little bit about websites today. So I am the webmaster with Raw Talk Podcast, and I also am one of the executive producers this year. Let me get set up. So this session is going to run until 3:35. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. I'll try to get to them at the end of my little talk. And if not, we'll also be having a session after this to walk through some of those other questions. Yeah, so let's get started. So a little bit about what we'll talk about today. First of all, I want to kind of break down what exactly constitutes a website, like what are the main components that actually are involved. We'll talk a little bit about the process of building one, and then at the end, just a brief coverage of a few other things that maybe you should know about if you're working with web stuff. So first of all, what actually is a website? Essentially, it's three parts. The first thing is its content, so basically text, code, images, that sort of stuff. And when most people imagine a website, basically that's what they're thinking about. But under the hood, there's also I've been advised I should turn my captions on. Sorry about that. There we go. Under the hood, there's also a server, which in our case, we use GitHub Pages because it's free, but there's lots of other options available. And you can also, you need a domain name. And so that's the actual thing that you need to pay for. So actually a domain name, what even is it? It's basically a big lookup table that tells whatever server you're using where to, or tells your browser to look at a particular server to actually find your content. So a lot of this stuff happens behind the scenes, but essentially at some point you're going to need to tell your domain name server to say, this is where you should find my content. And you should also tell your content that your domain name is this. So they need to kind of know about each other. The other thing about a domain name, I'm not aware of anyone that you can get for free. And so basically you should always expect to have to pay for a domain name, but there's a huge variability in very subtle differences within the domain name itself. So you can see here, climatefix.com is $3,000, 3.5 grand. Meanwhile, climatefix.ca is $3. So definitely poke around to different variations of your podcast, depending on your budget and particularity for what you actually want it to look like. So what is a host? If you try to build your own a server, it might look something like the right-hand side here, and probably that's not something you want to dabble in. It is a lot of work and very expensive, and definitely not something that you need to even worry about. But essentially, at some point, you will have to pay for some server that will live in a supercluster somewhere, like on the left-hand side here, and basically it will host your files. And when people ask for your website content, it will deliver that content, which is basically a bunch of code and images, to their computer over the internet. Again, you may have to pay for this. There are very few options to get this for free, but sometimes it's bundled with your website builder platform, which I'll talk about later. The last thing is actually the content. And so first and foremost, it's going to be actually whatever text you want to include as part of your experience on the web. But associated with that text is basically a whole bunch of code that tells your browser where to put that text on screen. And so the three main programming languages that are used in the web are HTML, which basically dictates the structure of everything that should appear on screen. So, you know, the header appears first and then stuff in the body, maybe something gets repeated a bunch of times and it all has the same structure. The CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. And basically that is tells you, should this text be large or bold or have this background or rounded corners and floating objects, these. And finally, JavaScript basically adds functionality. So when you click on stuff happens. You can get very complicated, but most websites probably don't even need any JavaScript at all. And finally, you have, obviously, as podcasts, most of us will have audio that we want to host on our website. And there's different ways of doing that. And then you may also need to upload some images to have them appear as well. So what does it actually take to actually build a website? First, I'll just kind of walk through some of the typical content that you might find in a podcasting website, these ones here. And then after, we'll talk about the two different main approaches, being a website builder or building your website actually from scratch. So what's the typical content that you might find on a podcast website? Your homepage, I always like to keep it as simple as possible. It should just basically be like your brand, like we've just learned about from Janine and the rest of the social media team. So it has like a logo, maybe links to your different social media, but essentially it should be very recognizable as soon as you land there. You should probably have an about page that is a lot more detailed about like how your podcast came to be, maybe a little bit about the topics you cover, some other things like that. You could have a team page that basically walks through, it should show people what you look like, in case that's important to you, and obviously walk through the different roles of the members on your team. Episodes, there's kind of two overall approaches, and they can be combined. One is basically just to have a big list of all your episodes, but the other thing you might consider is a separate web page for every single episode that has a lot more detail about things in that episode, and it's also a chance to kind of add details like links and images of the different guests that were all associated with that. Or actually, I should have mentioned here, that's also where we have our transcripts for every episode. And then it's always nice to have a contact page. So this is our homepage on Raw Talk Podcast. Maybe you've all seen it before. Again, very simple, nothing too fancy. Our About page includes a summary of about us, a few other things related to inclusion and diversity, so a commitment that we've made to that end. But we also have this section here that you might consider called like new listener. So if there's anybody who has never heard your podcast before, they might want to browse some of your episodes that you choose to highlight here. And that can just be a representative sample or specific episodes that you might want to highlight. Our team page looks like this. If you click on each person, it will pop up with a little bio about them and a slightly different photo of them kind of in action. So something that is obviously only possible with our brilliant photographers who do photo shoots for every single member. So we really appreciate that. And then everyone updates their bio every year, hopefully. This is our episode feed page. So basically each one of these is a link to a specific episode page. And it's basically just like a teaser of every little episode with these images. And then on a specific episode page, there will be the show notes, the date it was released. This is a player that our podcast hosting platform provides for us. And so it has like little options for navigating the different audio file. And then we also usually have links to various resources that we're associated with the episode at the bottom there. And usually kind of a prominent guest in the episode we feature here with a nice big bio. Our contact page actually has 3 different options. Just straight up emailing the team, which obviously is the easiest to do. We also have a mailing list link here. And then we recently added an anonymous contact form in case people want to get in touch with something sensitive or for whatever reason want to stay anonymous. So that might be something you consider that's basically not possible with email. When you're thinking about how to actually set all this stuff up, you definitely check out all the website builders. They have template email or template websites that you can kind of browse. And that's a great place to look for inspiration beyond just looking at other podcast websites that are obviously a great way to do that as well. So just like find elements you'd like to the menu bar, should it be on the right? Should it be centered? How large are the various elements on it? Photos versus kind of just going straight to your different episodes on the homepage. Yeah, lots of kind of options. So here's the key decision. Do you want to build your website from scratch or use one of the many website builders that are available? We'll get to later the fact that Raw Talk, we actually built ours from scratch, but that's because I had kind of a lot of web experience before. It is something you might consider if you want all the control over all those features, but I'll also briefly touch on kind of the key elements of a website builder, especially for podcasting. Obviously, there's costs, and there's obviously features that are maybe limited with the website builders. But on the other hand, when you build your website from scratch, depending on how complicated it can be very, very time consuming. And frankly, I think I'm the only one right now who knows how to update our website, or who at least does it regularly. And so handover is definitely a consideration that we still need to work out if ever I leave the podcast. Okay, so the website builder space, there's like maybe 4 or 5 different key options out there. WordPress definitely was first to the game, but they've since really started lacking on a lot of the features that they support. And they also aim to kind of make everything a separate plugin. And overall, the experience, I think, from a lot of people is not so good anymore. They also don't offer hosting. So that key component that I mentioned, you can generate your content in WordPress, but they don't offer a service to host it. And that's just so that they can, basically get more money out of you by sending you to a different service who will host it for a fee. I've been really impressed with Wix as I was playing around with these different builders for making this talk. They have a lot of great features, really, really fine-tuned control over the different elements. And they have great plugins as well that come preloaded, so you don't have to pay for them like WordPress. And a lot of those add a lot of flexibility, including a nice way of integrating your podcast feed. And I'll talk about that in just 2 seconds. So this is the Wix editor. Everything is graphical, so you see what your website will end up looking like roughly as you're here. You can change lots of different things. This is a text element that's highlighted here, has control over the font size, all the standard things that you would see in a word processing software. And then all of these elements here, I think some of these are to do with theme, so you can choose theme colors for the overall website and keep it very consistent, like Janine was mentioning. Different ways of editing this menu bar and adding new pages and moving things around. If you ever kind of dabbled in one of these, it seems to me to be very intuitive. And if not, there's tons of resources out there as well to actually learn what features you may not be aware of yet in terms of some of these builders. Now, one of the key elements that you'll definitely want to have when you're adding a website builder for your podcast website is to actually integrate your podcasts automatically. Like, you don't want to have to go and copy paste a bunch of stuff from wherever you're hosting your podcast onto your website with the possibility of making errors or like not having things be quick at updating. So one of the things that they offer here with Wix, and most of the other platforms that I looked into did as well, is basically to take this little URL here. We host ours through Blueberry, so it's like feeds.blueberry.com/feeds. or / whatever, some XML file. And if you basically attach this to this little element that Wix provides, it will automatically create this whole repeated list of all your different podcast episodes. And you can customize the order and the various sizes of these things. So really, really slick. And then you never have to worry about updating your website when a new episode comes out. You can do it manually as well if you want to add more particular features, but for many people, this might be sufficient. That's all I'll say about website builders. I won't spend too much time really because it's kind of learn as you go. I could cover any number of features, but really you're going to have to explore yourself. Fortunately, they're really, really good quality these days, and I think it should be hopefully easy to go through. So this is our approach to generating a website. It may not be applicable for everyone, but I think some people may also be interested in learning how these things can be done from scratch. And this is some of the stuff that's actually going on under the hood with the website builders. So on the left-hand side is kind of the most basic possible elements. We store all of our data associated with episodes, like the show notes, who was working on the team, the different images that are associated, and a caption, a whole bunch of kind of structured data in little JSON files, which is just a type of code file that's structured data, like a database, basically. And then we add a bunch of templates associated with those content and say, how should this content appear on the page, which is basically just HTML, like I was saying. That's the structured language. Then I use a Python package called Jinja to basically loop through all of the content that we have saved in a bunch of files somewhere to generate different static HTML files for every single possible JSON element that we had in that little database. And basically that's mostly to do with episodes, but we also have little JSON files for every team member, for example, and a few other kind of small things. So at the end of the day, that produces some HTML and a few CSS and JavaScript files. And basically that plus the images will all get uploaded to our GitHub server, in addition to a few static packages, which is basically code that other people have written. And so all of that ends up, I manually push it onto our server, and then that server makes that available to our users through our domain name. And also, like I said, we upload our audio to Blueberry, which is our audio host. And then that player is made available by Blueberry if you basically copy that little code into the HTML files here. And then that code will generate that little player that appears that you saw. So hopefully that wasn't too wild and crazy. There's a lot of different moving parts here, but at the end of the day, it gives us a lot of fine-tuned control over the appearance of the website, and that's the approach that we've chosen to take. If you want to take this approach, some key pieces of software and tools that you will need to actually make this happen. First is an editor. So many of you, I think, are graduate students, and you probably write code of some form or another. I don't think there's many editors that are actually specifically designed for web development, but most standard web or standard editors will basically syntax highlight your code here so that it's easy to see the different elements and how they interact with each other. Like this is a function associated with this selector, or I don't know, just different ways of highlighting the things to make it easier to navigate. This is Atom. Another popular one is Notepad++. There's lots of them right there. But essentially, this will help you write all those potentially template code or the end product code. You could just write it directly. Packages. If you want to write literally every functionality that you want to include in your website from scratch, you can do it, but I would highly recommend against it. There's lots of people who have been programming for years and years who have come together in huge communities to produce really, really slick code. And these are often available in packages. Popular ones include jQuery and Bootstrap. Don't really have time to get into their various features, except maybe I'll say Bootstrap, a lot of like out-of-the-box copy-paste type code that you can basically, this is their documentation page. Oops, didn't mean to click. This is their documentation page. So they will support common features that you might want to include in your website. In this case, there's a carousel, what's called carousel. So something that basically like spins around with different images. And you can click these arrows and they have all of that functionality built easily so that you have to do less work to actually include that in your website. And basically you could just copy stuff like this, replacing the specific image files that you might want to include. And then to include these packages in your website, you basically copy one little element like this, and this is basically the path to a file that will get associated with your website and loaded with every single page. So that's how you could include a package. The other thing that's very important to have when you are writing your own website from scratch is a local web server. So most of the builders will provide some option for you to preview the site before you push the changes to the live site for your end users to actually look at. Now, depending on how much traffic you have, it may not be important to push some changes before everything's super clean. But if you do, once you have a good following, maybe you don't want to have things going live until you're absolutely sure they look good. So the local server is basically the ability to pretend your server, which would normally host and serve your files, is actually on your own computer. Python is basically the easiest way to do this. It's one line and it looks like this. So if you're in your website folder, you just write python -m http.server, and basically it will allow you to put this URL, localhost 8000, and then that will pretend to be the website as if all of those files were available on your computer, but pretend like they're being served from a server. And so you can navigate it and experience what your website would look like before pushing it to your real server. Hopefully this isn't too crazy. The last thing is you will need a real public server. And so like I said, we use GitHub Pages. It's great. It allows you to basically host your files online and then have them be served to users as if it were a website. And in this case, the key thing that I want you to take away is that your domain name needs to know about GitHub being your server. So somewhere in your domain name configuration settings, you need to say, this domain name now points to these GitHub servers. And similarly, GitHub Pages here I'm showing needs to know about our domain name, which is different than the default one that they will generate for you. And in this case, we're www.rawtalkpodcast.com. And so now your server also knows that the domain name associated with it is whatever your domain name is. There's lots of other tutorials online. I don't think I really have time to go through what all the different elements here are going on, but there's lots of great tutorials for how to set up GitHub Pages as a free server if you want to write your own website. Okay, so that was kind of the very, very crash course in terms of how you could build a website using a website builder and how you could build a website from scratch. These are a few things that are mostly relevant to both and just some things to consider when you're actually designing your website. First of all, it's called the developer pane. I'm wondering if I can show this right now. Basically, it allows you to inspect the code that was used to generate the current page that you're actually looking at. And I think I can. I think you guys can see that. Let's see if it pops up in a minute. Oh, maybe not. No, I think Open says no. Okay, anyways. So essentially, it has a great little tool here called the inspector. This is Firefox, by the way, but Chrome has something similar. And you can basically move your little cursor after you've highlighted the selector over any element on the current page. And after you kind of click it, it will bring you over here and you can inspect all the different properties of that element. So its width, the font color, the font size, and essentially if anything isn't working, you can kind of start to inspect the various classes associated with that element, basically being things that are trying to define its properties. And maybe it's often the case that one class has higher priority than another one. And so that's why it's appearing in a way that you didn't expect. Or maybe it turns out that the actual HTML structure of the elements is in a different order than you were hoping. And so that's why things are appearing out of order on the page. But it's a great way to basically inspect the different elements that are available on the page. Another thing, if you're doing any functionality, is the console. And basically that allows you to print things print things to a little console over here. So messages to yourself halfway through your little script. You're like, oh, did it work until here? And you say, hello world. And then it pops up in the console here. It says, hello world. It's like, OK, I made it that far. Maybe something downstream is broken. And then the last thing is an emulator. I know it's very hard to see, but right up here is a little thing that allows you to pretend the current web page is on a phone or a different size laptop or an iPad or whatever. So it's a great way to basically test what your website will look like on mobile before you go live. And many of the website builders have that built in as well. As I was mentioning, responsive design is something that you'll want to consider. Most of the website builders will have this somehow built in, but make sure that if you're creating your website, that the width isn't static and that when the screen size gets resized, basically moving from a desktop to a mobile environment, that things will rearrange in a nice way that the screen size gets used to its best extent. And so in this case, you can see we basically stack things vertically instead of horizontally. Packages are great for supporting this functionality as well because they have a lot of this stuff out of the box. As I mentioned, this is mostly available or mostly relevant if you're building your own website, but template languages will basically allow you to loop over things and avoid copy pasting code. In this case, the example we have is like for every user in some list of users, it will repeat this element, which is basically a list item. And then we say like, oh, we have a URL associated with that user and a username. And so it will repeat a bunch of links to different users in some list. And the end product of this will look like a bunch of usernames with their links. So that's a great way to avoid copy pasting code, which is prone to errors and also time consuming if you ever want to change a lot of different things at the same time in terms of your structure. I think this is the second last thing. There are ways of controlling what content is previewed when you share that particular web page on social media. And so we prefer that we have a little photo associated with that that image or with that web page that is like relevant to it, and it also has some information about the content of the episode itself. So these are like if we were to share the same number 74, episode 74 on our different social medias, this is the content that would appear. And the way that it gets implemented is basically through these little meta tags, and you define other stuff in the content here that will control these elements. Last thing, Google Analytics is just a great way to monitor all your different traffic. So consider setting that up. There's tutorials online. I don't have time to get into it, but it's a great way to kind of monitor which pages are getting a lot of traffic. Maybe you want to spice them up a little bit, or maybe people are having trouble finding a particular page that you thought would be more being used more. Yeah, and that's it. Unfortunately, sorry, I don't have too much time for questions, but I'll try to take them as fast as I can, and then we'll continue in the sessions. How did I learn to build a website? I did it a lot on my own spare time, basically. I just tinkered. I tried to make my websites for various people in my life. Like my parents have small business, and I kind of dabble for them. What programming languages have I learned to build a website? Many people don't consider HTML, JavaScript, and CSS a language per se, but those are the key 3 languages that underpin most of the web. JSON is not really a language, it's basically just structured text. Another visual editor is VS Code. Yes, it's great, although I don't love Microsoft, so we'll leave that one there. Any tips on making sure your website is practical to use? I come across websites that are difficult to navigate. Quick tips I would just say is like asking other people to try to use it. And we've had lots of great feedback from the team. And then, like I mentioned earlier, there's an accessibility checker that can be used to test whether the website has any problems to do with its accessibility. How much time does it take to add each episode? I would say 15 to 30 minutes now, because things are mostly pretty smooth. Cool, I think I got them all. And I think I'm out of time. So I will hand it over to Nathan and Jan, who are up next talking about budgets and how to get money for your podcast. Thanks.